My name is Marcus Hawthorne, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1963. I was 45 then, working as a geologist for a university in Texas. Life was simple, just me and my 16-year-old daughter Emily, traveling in our shiny Airstream trailer, studying rocks across the state. But what we encountered in Big Bend National Park changed our lives forever. I still remember that scorching June morning when we pulled into the Chizos Mountains. The drought had turned everything into a dusty brown canvas, and the heat waves made the distant peaks dance like snakes in the air. Emily sat next to me in our old pickup truck, her long brown hair tied back, nose buried in one of her mystery novels as usual. She had her mother's eyes, those deep, knowing eyes that seemed to see things others couldn't. "Dad," she said suddenly, putting down her book, "something feels different about this place." I laughed it off then. If only I had listened more carefully to those words. We were supposed to stay for just 2 weeks. I had a simple job, study some strange rock formations that the university couldn't explain. The locals had been telling wild stories about the area, about rocks that bled when broken and shadows that moved on their own. As a man of science, I dismissed these tales as desert fever talking. That's when we met Diego Reyes. He was a local guide, 67 years old with a face weathered like the canyon walls themselves. The moment he saw Emily, something changed in his expression. He looked at her the way someone might look at a bomb about to go off, with fear, respect, and a hint of hope. "The Cambiaformas," he whispered when we first set up camp. "They watch us now." I didn't know then that this would be the beginning of the most terrifying story of our lives. A story about ancient creatures that wore human skin, about blood magic older than the mountains themselves, and about my daughter's destiny that had been written in the desert sand long before she was born. That first night in the Chizos Mountains is still burned into my memory. We had parked our Airstream, that's our silver trailer home, in a quiet spot surrounded by tall rocks. Emily and I were settling in for dinner when we heard it, howling. But this wasn't normal coyote howling. "Dad?" Emily's voice shook as she looked out the window. "Those coyotes, they're standing up, like people." I thought she was seeing things in the dark, but when I looked outside, my blood ran cold. There they were, 5 or 6 coyotes, standing on their back legs in a circle around our trailer. Their shadows stretched long in the moonlight, looking more human than animal. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but Emily's face told me she knew better. She was always special that way, seeing things others missed, feeling things others couldn't. We spent the next few days exploring the area. I'd break rocks, take samples, and write in my notebook, normal scientist stuff. But nothing felt normal anymore. Emily kept finding these old drawings on the rocks, petroglyphs we call them. But she swore they changed positions when she looked away. "The pictures moved again, Dad," she'd say, her voice quiet but sure. "That coyote drawing? It was facing left before. Now it's facing right." Diego, our guide, would just nod when she said these things. He knew something but wouldn't say much. Just kept muttering about Los Cambiaformas, the shapeshifters, and how we needed protection. Then we found the cattle, 3 of them, laid out in a perfect triangle each one. Well, I won't describe what was done to them. But they weren't killed by any mountain lion or bear. The symbols carved into their sides made sure we knew that. That's when Diego finally started talking. He sat us down one evening, his old hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "This land," he said, looking straight at Emily, "it belongs to them, the Skinwalker clans. They've been here longer than any of us, fighting their ancient war. And now," he paused, looking at my daughter with those knowing eyes, "now they know you're here." I wanted to laugh it off. I really did. But then Emily looked in the trailer's mirror and screamed. She said she saw a man with a coyote's eyes staring back at her. When I looked, I just saw her reflection. But the mirror? It was covered in those same symbols we'd found on the cattle. That's when I realized we weren't just studying the desert anymore. The desert was studying us. Things got stranger when Ranger Johnson showed up at our trailer. He seemed normal enough. tall, wearing his park uniform, with a friendly smile. But Emily grabbed my arm the moment she saw him, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "That's not a real ranger, Dad," she whispered, her face pale. "His shadow, it's wrong." I didn't understand what she meant until I looked down. While the sun was to our left, Ranger Johnson's shadow stretched to the left too, like it was running away from the light instead of following it. Diego pulled me aside later that evening. "Your daughter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She can see through their disguises now. It's starting." He told us about the two Skinwalker clans that had lived in these mountains forever. The Desert Clan, who protected the sacred places, and the Mountain Clan, who wanted power no matter the cost. They looked like normal people most of the time, but Emily could see what they really were. That night, we found the underground chamber. I was following some unusual rock patterns, as any geologist would, when the ground just opened up beneath our feet. The chamber was filled with, well, the only way I can describe them is skin suits hanging on the walls. Like empty human costumes, waiting to be worn. Emily wasn't scared anymore. She was fascinated. "I can feel them, Dad," she said, touching the chamber walls. "They're all around us. Some want to protect us, but others." She didn't need to finish that sentence. We could feel the others, the bad ones, watching us from the shadows. Their eyes glowed in the dark like dying embers. Diego started performing protection rituals around our trailer. He burned sage and drew symbols in the dirt with his walking stick. I thought it was just superstition until I saw the symbols glow blue under the moonlight. "You're Emily," Diego said one night. "She's special. Her mother. Did she ever tell you where she came from?" I shook my head. Emily's mother had disappeared when Emily was just a baby. Never told me about her family, her past, nothing. "The blood of the Ancient Ones runs in her veins," Diego said. "Both clans can sense it. That's why they're gathering. The Desert Clan wants to protect her, but the Mountain Clan..." He looked at the dark peaks looming above us. "They want to use her power for something terrible." I was a scientist. I dealt in facts, in things I could touch and measure. But watching Emily that night, seeing her trace glowing symbols in the air with her fingers without even realizing it, I knew we had stumbled into something bigger than science could explain. The war was coming, and somehow, my teenage daughter was right in the middle of it. It all came to a head during the blood moon. That night, the desert itself seemed to come alive. The sand swirled in strange patterns, and the rocks. I swear they were breathing. Emily was in the trailer when it started. She was drawing in her notebook, not her usual sketches, but those same ancient symbols we'd seen everywhere. Her hands moved on their own, like someone else was guiding them. "They're coming," she said, not looking up. "Both clans. They're coming for me." That's when we saw them. People walking out of the darkness, dozens of them. But they weren't really people, not anymore. Some moved like coyotes. Others had eyes that glowed like eagles. The Desert Clan, Diego called them. They formed a circle around our trailer, facing outward, protecting us. Then the Mountain Clan arrived. They came down from the hills, their bodies shifting between human and animal as they moved. Their leader looked almost normal, except when he smiled, his teeth were sharp and his eyes were pure black. "The girl," he said in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Give us the girl and you'll live." Diego stepped forward, holding up his walking stick. "She belongs to neither clan," he said. "She is the new keeper." I didn't understand what was happening, but Emily did. She walked out of the trailer, and the air around her seemed to shimmer. "I remember now," she said. "I remember who I am." The fight that broke out was like nothing I'd ever seen. The Skinwalkers moved faster than any human could, changing shapes as they fought. The Desert Clan fought to protect us, while the Mountain Clan tried to break through to Emily. Diego started chanting, drawing symbols in the air that burst into blue flame. "Your mother," he shouted to Emily over the chaos. "She was our last keeper, the one who maintained balance between the clans. Now it's your turn." Emily stood in the middle of it all. calm as could be. She raised her hands, and the desert responded. Sand rose up like waves, rocks cracked open with blinding light, and the wind howled with 1,000 voices. I watched my daughter, my little girl who used to be scared of thunderstorms, command the very earth itself. The mountain clan's leader lunged at her, but she just looked at him, and his human disguise melted away, revealing what he truly was. But we weren't safe yet. The mountain clan was losing, but they had one last terrible plan. And Diego knew what he had to do to stop them. Diego knew something we didn't. As the mountain clan leader prepared for a final attack, he grabbed Emily's hand and pressed his walking stick into it. Your mother gave her life to protect this power, he said softly. I made her a promise that I would watch over you until you were ready. His eyes were filled with tears. And now you are. Before we could stop him, Diego walked straight into the middle of the battle. He started speaking words in an ancient language, and his body began to glow with a bright blue light. The mountain clan tried to run, but it was too late. Dad! Emily screamed. Close your eyes. There was a flash so bright it turned night into day. When I opened my eyes again, Diego was gone. But so were most of the mountain clan members. The ones that survived scattered into the darkness, howling in defeat. The desert clan bowed to Emily. Their leader, an old woman with eagle feathers in her hair, spoke. The balance must be kept. You are the new keeper, like your mother before you. Emily looked different now, stronger somehow, more sure of herself. She touched our trailer, and symbols appeared on its silver surface, glowing softly in the dark. We can't leave, Dad, she said. This is where I'm supposed to be. This is who I'm supposed to be. She was right. Over the next few days, we learned the truth. How her mother had been the previous keeper of the balance between the clans. How Diego had watched over Emily all these years, waiting for her powers to awaken. How our random assignment to study these rocks wasn't random at all. The Desert Clan taught Emily how to use her powers. They showed her how to read the ancient symbols, how to listen to the desert's warnings, how to keep the peace between the human world and theirs. Our trailer became a sacred place. Emily turned it into what she called a moving boundary, a safe space between the human world and the skinwalker world. We still travel around the park, but now with a purpose. Emily keeps the peace, just like her mother did. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we see Diego, not as a ghost exactly, but as a feeling in the wind, a whisper in the desert air. He became part of the land itself, still watching over us, still protecting the balance. The mountain clan is still out there, hiding in the shadows. But they're afraid now, afraid of the girl who can see their true forms, who can command the desert itself. As for me, I'm still a scientist, but now I know there are some things science can't explain, some things you just have to believe in. That was 10 years ago. Emily is 26 now, and she's become something amazing. Our Airstream trailer, covered in those glowing symbols, has traveled every corner of Big Bend. People just think we're regular park researchers, but we're really keeping the peace between two worlds. Emily can do things that still surprise me. She can talk to the wind, make the desert sand form pictures that tell stories, and even heal injured animals with just a touch. But what makes me proudest is how she handles both clans, like a wise judge who knows just what to say to keep everyone getting along. The Desert Clan visits us often. They bring news and warnings, teaching Emily more of their old ways. Sometimes they look human, sometimes they don't. But Emily always knows who they really are. She says it's like seeing two pictures at once, what they want everyone to see and what they really are. The Mountain Clan? They're still around. We see their tracks sometimes, or hear their howls in the distance. They're waiting, watching, hoping Emily will make a mistake. But she's stronger than they know. Just last month, she caught 2 of them, trying to perform a dark ritual in one of the caves. She didn't fight them. She just stood there and let the desert itself push them out. I've started a secret journal, writing down everything we learn. Emily says it's important to keep records for the next keeper, whenever they come. Sometimes, when I'm writing late at night, I feel Diego's presence. The papers ruffle without any wind, and I know he's reading over my shoulder, making sure I get the stories right. Our trailer has become something special too. Emily calls it our moving sanctuary. Wherever we park, the area becomes safe from dark magic. Animals come to rest near us, and people who pass by feel peaceful without knowing why. The symbols on its sides change color to warn us of danger, blue for safety, red for trouble coming. But the strangest thing? The prophecy. Emily found it carved inside a cave last spring, words that glow different colors depending on who reads them. It talks about another war coming, bigger than the last one. Emily says we're not ready to face it yet, but we will be. Sometimes I look at my daughter, this powerful young woman who can command ancient magic, and I still see that little girl who used to read mystery books in our truck. She caught me staring yesterday and smiled. "Don't worry, Dad," she said, her eyes twinkling just like her mother's used to. "As long as we keep the balance, we'll be okay." And you know what? I believe her. Because here, in the Chisos Mountains, where the shadows walk and the rocks whisper secrets, my daughter has found her true calling. She's the keeper of the balance, the protector of ancient powers, and the guardian of a peace most people don't even know exists. But that's not the end of our story. Just last week, something different started happening. Emily noticed it first. New symbols appearing in the morning dew. Ones we'd never seen before. They looked like a mix of starbursts and spirals, glowing with a strange purple light instead of the usual blue or red. "The desert's trying to tell us something, Dad," Emily said one morning, her coffee getting cold in her hands. "Something's changing in the spirit world." We started seeing weird things. Birds flying in perfect circles over certain spots in the desert, rocks that hummed at night with a deep sound, like a giant's heartbeat. Even our trailer's symbols started shifting on their own, forming patterns we couldn't read. The Desert Clan is worried too. Their eldest member, a woman who can turn into an eagle, told us that the ancient burial grounds in the deepest parts of the park were glowing. "The old ones are restless," she said. "They haven't been this active since before the last Great War." Last night, Emily woke me up at midnight. She was standing outside, looking at the stars, but they weren't in their right places. They had formed a giant warning symbol across the whole sky. "The Mountain Clan isn't our biggest problem anymore," she whispered. "Something older is waking up, something that was here before even the Skinwalkers. This morning, we found footprints around our trailer, but they weren't human or animal. They looked like tiny whirlwinds had walked across the sand, each step creating a perfect spiral pattern." Emily's powers are changing too. Yesterday, she didn't just talk to the wind, she became the wind for a few seconds. I saw her turn into a dust devil, swirling across the desert before becoming herself again. It scared her as much as it scared me. Diego's presence feels stronger now. The air around our trailer crackles with energy, and sometimes we hear his voice in the wind, trying to warn us. But the words are unclear, like he's speaking through static. "We need to prepare," Emily said this morning. "The next war won't be between the clans. It'll be between this world and something else, something that's been sleeping under the desert for thousands of years." I'm writing this down now because people need to know. If you're ever in the Chisos Mountains and see a silver trailer covered in glowing symbols, or a young woman walking alone in the desert with the wind swirling around her like a faithful dog, you'll know who we are. And if the stars start moving in strange patterns, or if you hear whispers in the wind that sound like ancient warnings, well, just know that Emily and I are out here, standing guard between our world and whatever's trying to break through from the other side. In that deepest cave, behind all those twisting tunnels, we found something that changed everything. It was a huge chamber, bigger than a football field, with walls that glowed like mother of pearl. In the center was a pool of water that shone with its own light. Emily walked right up to that pool and looked in. What she saw made her gasp. "Dad," she whispered, "it's showing us everything. The first skinwalkers, the ancient spirits, and Mom." In that water, we saw the truth. The Mountain Clan and Desert Clan weren't really enemies. They were two halves of the same whole, split apart long ago by fear and greed. And that new threat we felt? It was coming because the clans were divided. Emily knew what she had to do. She called both clans to the cave. Even the Mountain Clan came, drawn by the ancient power in that place. Standing by the glowing pool, Emily spoke words that seemed to come from the desert itself. "We don't need two clans anymore," she said. "We need one family like in the beginning." The pool's light grew brighter, filling the cave. I saw Diego's spirit there too, standing proud beside my daughter. Then something amazing happened. The leaders of both clans stepped into the light, and their true forms merged together. Not coyote or eagle or wolf, but something new and beautiful. One by one, the others followed. The Mountain Clan's darkness faded away, and the Desert Clan's rigid rules softened. They became something in between, guardians who could walk in both light and shadow. Emily's final test wasn't fighting evil, it was bringing peace. Now, our trailer still roams the Chisos Mountains, but things are different. The symbols don't warn of danger anymore, they sing with joy. The United Clan helps Emily protect the desert from other dangers that try to creep in from the spirit world. As for me, I'm still writing in my journal, still studying rocks, but now I understand that science and magic aren't so different. They're just different ways of seeing the same truth. Emily says it best. The real power isn't in being able to change shapes or command the wind. It's in being able to change hearts. So if you're ever in Big Bend National Park and you see a silver trailer glowing under the stars, or a young woman walking with the desert wind dancing around her, just smile and wave. We'll be there, keeping the balance, protecting the peace, and remembering that the greatest magic of all is bringing people together. That's our story. At least, that's all I can tell for now. The desert keeps its own secrets, and some of them are still unfolding. My name is Richard Thompson. I'm 38 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was living a normal life after leaving the military. That was before my brother Timothy disappeared in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in Wisconsin. The police gave up searching after a month, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Timothy is the only family I have left. I'm writing this down because people need to know what happened here. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Some places should be left alone, and some legends aren't just stories. It all started when I packed up my old 1976 Winnebago. The thing's not pretty, but it's built like a tank and has everything I need. As I drove north into Wisconsin, the radio started acting weird. At first, I thought it was just bad reception, but then I started hearing voices between the static. They weren't speaking English, and somehow, the sounds made my skin crawl. The small town near the forest was my first stop. Something felt off right away. The locals would stop talking when I walked into the diner. They'd stare, then look away quickly when I caught them. When I asked about Timothy, showing his picture around, an old man at the counter grabbed my arm. "Go home, son," he whispered. His eyes were wide with fear. "That forest, it has the hunger that never sleeps. Your brother? He's probably already gone." I should have listened. Maybe if I had, things would be different. But how could I? Timothy's last text message kept playing in my mind. "Rich, I found something incredible, but something's wrong. I need help. Please come." As I drove my RV into the forest, the temperature dropped suddenly. It was summer, but my breath came out in white puffs. The trees seemed to lean over the road, their branches reaching like crooked fingers. And then I saw it. The first sign that this wasn't going to be a normal search and rescue mission. There were claw marks on the trees, deep gouges that spiraled up the trunks, not like any animal I'd ever seen. And in the fading daylight, I swear, I saw something dark dripping from them, like the trees were bleeding. I found Timothy's campsite just before dark. His tent was still there, ripped from the inside out. His camping gear was scattered everywhere, and there were dark stains on the ground that looked too much like blood. But it was his camera, still recording and covered in frost despite the summer evening, that made my heart stop. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of my nightmare in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. I parked my RV in a small clearing near Timothy's destroyed campsite. The sun was setting fast, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. My military training taught me to be careful, so I decided to check Timothy's camera first from the safety of my Winnebago. The camera was ice cold in my hands, which was strange because it was still summer. When I opened the screen, my hands started shaking. The last video was dated just 2 weeks ago. Timothy's face filled the screen. He looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. His hands were shaking as he spoke. Day 15 in the forest. Something's wrong with me, Rich. I'm so hungry all the time. The food I brought doesn't help anymore. I keep hearing things at night, voices calling me. And the cold, it follows me everywhere. Last night, I saw something in the trees. It was tall, so tall, with white eyes, and I think it used to be human. The video cut off there. I sat in silence, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from deep in the forest, a sound that started like a human cry but ended like an animal's howl. I've heard all kinds of sounds in my military days, but nothing like this. It made my whole body go cold. I grabbed my flashlight and hunting rifle, not taking any chances after seeing those claw marks. Outside, the temperature had dropped even more. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost was starting to form on my RV's windows from the inside. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dirt. They started as normal human boot prints, like Timothy's size. But as they went on, they got longer, deeper, more like animal tracks. They led into the darkest part of the forest. I was about to follow them when I heard a twig snap behind me. I turned around slowly, pointing my flashlight into the darkness. There stood an old hunter, his face lined with worry. His name was Jack Wilson, and what he told me next changed everything I thought I knew about this forest. "You're Thompson's brother," he said. It wasn't a question. "We need to talk. There are things in these woods, things you need to know about. And we don't have much time. The sun's almost gone, and they hunt at night." The way he said "they" made my skin crawl. As we walked back to my RV, I could have sworn I saw movement in the trees, something tall and thin, moving too smoothly to be human. And somewhere in the distance, another scream echoed through the forest, closer this time. Inside my RV, Jack sat at the small table, his hands wrapped around a hot cup of coffee. His right arm was badly bandaged, and I could see dark frost marks creeping up his neck. Something had hurt him, and recently, "I've been tracking these things for 20 years, Jack said, his voice shaking. "They used to be people, you know. People who stayed too long in these woods, who got too hungry, too cold. The Ojibwe tribes called them Wendigos." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, but after what I'd seen in Timothy's video, I just listened. "Your brother," Jack continued, "he came here to study local legends, but he found something real instead. These creatures, they don't just kill you, they change you. First comes the hunger, nothing fills it. Then the cold, it gets inside you. And then..." He pulled up his sleeve, showing me his arm. The skin was nearly transparent, with black veins running through it. Suddenly, all the food in my RV started to smell rotten. When I opened the fridge, everything inside was covered in black mold, though I'd just bought it yesterday. "They do that," Jack said quietly. "They spoil food, make you hungrier. I've been fighting it for 3 days now." A loud thump on the RV's roof made us both freeze. Something was up there, moving slowly. The ceiling creaked under its weight. Jack's eyes went wide with fear. "Turn off the lights," he whispered. "Now." I hit the switches, plunging us into darkness. Through the skylight, I saw something looking down at us. It had my brother's face, but wrong. Stretched too long, with white eyes that glowed in the dark. Its mouth opened, showing too many teeth. "Timothy?" I whispered. The thing that wore my brother's face pressed its hand against the glass. Where it touched, frost spread in spiral patterns. Then it spoke, in a voice that was almost Timothy's. "So, hungry, brother?" Jack grabbed my arm. "We need to move, now. They're hunting, and your brother. He's not the only one out there." As if to prove his point, more screams echoed through the forest, coming from all directions. I counted at least 5 different voices, each one a horrible mix of human and animal. "There's a way to save him," Jack said, pulling out an old leather journal. "But we'll need to survive the night first. And Richard." He looked at me with dead serious eyes. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't look them in the eyes. That's how they get in your head." The thing on the roof screamed again, and this time I could hear a tiny bit of my brother's real voice in there, calling for help. That's when I knew I couldn't leave, no matter how dangerous it was. I had to save Timothy, or die trying. We had to run. The RV wasn't safe anymore. The windows were completely covered in frost, and we could hear them scratching at the walls. Jack grabbed his bag and I took my rifle, some supplies, and Timothy's camera. We slipped out through the emergency exit at the back. The forest at night was different, like stepping into another world. The trees seemed alive, swaying without any wind. The moon was full and blood red, casting strange shadows everywhere. The temperature had dropped so low that my fingers were going numb, even with gloves on. "There's a bunker," Jack whispered as we moved through the trees. "Built by the tribal elders years ago. We'll be safe there until—" He stopped talking suddenly. Ahead of us, standing between 2 trees, was something that made my blood freeze. It looked like a person, but it was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that reached almost to the ground. Its skin was white as snow and stretched tight over its bones. "Don't move," Jack breathed. "It hasn't seen us yet." But then I heard Timothy's voice coming from behind the creature. "Rich, help me, please." My heart nearly stopped. It sounded exactly like him, like when we were kids and he needed my help. I almost took a step forward, but Jack's hand gripped my arm hard. "It's not him," Jack hissed. "They can copy voices. They use them to lure people." The creature turned its head toward us, too fast, like a broken puppet. Its eyes were solid white, glowing in the darkness. Behind it, I saw more shapes moving in the shadows. Tall, thin figures with antlers growing from their heads. We ran. There's no shame in admitting it. We ran as fast as we could through the dark forest. The creatures followed, moving between the trees like shadows, their feet barely touching the ground. Their screams filled the air, some sounding like Timothy, others like people I didn't know. Jack led the way, jumping over fallen logs and ducking under branches. I could hear him breathing hard, see the frost spreading up his neck. He was changing too, fighting against whatever was trying to turn him into one of them. "There." Jack pointed to what looked like an old storm cellar built into a hillside. But before we could reach it, one of the creatures appeared right in front of us. This one I recognized. It was the thing that had Timothy's face. It reached for me with long, clawed fingers. "Brother," it said in Timothy's voice, "I'm so cold, so hungry. Join us." I raised my rifle, my hands shaking. How could I shoot something that looked like my brother? But Jack shoved me aside and threw something at the creature, a small pouch that burst open. Whatever was inside made the creature shriek and back away, giving us just enough time to reach the bunker. We slammed the heavy metal door shut behind us, and I heard multiple things crash against it. The bunker was cold and dark, but at least we were safe. For now. "What was in that pouch?" I asked Jack as we caught our breath. "Sacred herbs," he said, sliding down against the wall. "The elders taught me, but I'm running out. And Richard." He pulled up his sleeve again. The black veins had spread halfway up his arm. "We don't have much time. Not for your brother, and not for me." The bunker was bigger than it looked from outside. Jack found an old lantern and lit it, showing walls covered in strange symbols and old photographs. Some of the photos showed people normal at first, then changing, becoming like the things outside. My stomach turned when I saw dates on them going back to the 1800s. "This is where the tribal elders kept their records," Jack said, his voice getting weaker. "Everything they knew about the Wendigos." He started coughing, and I saw frost forming on his lips. I helped him sit down and noticed his skin was getting paler. "Jack, you're getting worse." "I know," he said, pulling out the old journal. "That's why you need to learn everything now. The ritual. It's our only chance to save your brother. And maybe me, if we're fast enough." Above us, we could hear them walking on the bunker's roof. The metal creaked under their weight, and sometimes we heard Timothy's voice calling down to us. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the journal Jack handed me. "The transformation takes about 2 weeks," Jack explained, his teeth chattering from the cold inside him. "First stage is the hunger, nothing fills it. Second stage, the cold gets in your bones. Third stage." He held up his blackened arm. "The body starts to change. Final stage, you lose your human mind completely." I flipped through the journal's pages, seeing drawings of the creatures and notes about the ritual. "How long do you have?" "Maybe a day. Your brother, he's almost gone, but there might be a little humanity left. The ritual has to be done under the blood moon, which is tonight. But we need 3 things." Suddenly, the lantern flickered. The temperature dropped so low I could see my breath. Jack's eyes went wide. "They're getting in," he whispered. A long, pale hand with black claws was reaching through a crack in the wall. Ice spread from where it touched, and the metal groaned as it froze. "Quick," Jack said, tearing pages from the journal. "Take these. You'll need the tribal elder's necklace. It's hidden in the box over there. A piece of the Wendigo you're trying to save. Anything from before they changed. And..." He stopped, looking at his infected arm. Blood from someone fighting the transformation. The wall cracked more. Another hand reached through. "Jack, we need to move." "No," he said firmly, pulling out a knife. "I'll give you the third thing you need. My blood while I'm still human enough to choose. Take it and run. There's a tunnel in the back. It leads to the sacred site." "I'm not leaving you." He grabbed my shirt. "Listen, this is my choice. I've hunted these things for 20 years. Let me help stop them. Take the blood and go. Save your brother." The wall broke open with a sound like shattering ice. The Wendigos were coming in, their white eyes glowing in the darkness. Jack pushed me toward the back of the bunker and cut his arm, filling a small bottle with his blood. "Go," he shouted, pressing the bottle into my hand. "And Richard, if you can't save me, don't let me become one of them." The last thing I saw was Jack standing up to face the creatures, his knife ready, frost spreading across his face. Then I ran into the tunnel, clutching the journal pages, the necklace, and the bottle of Jack's blood. Behind me, I heard screams, both human and inhuman, echoing through the darkness. The tunnel was pitch black, but I couldn't risk using my flashlight. I kept one hand on the cold wall, moving as fast as I dared. Every few seconds I heard screams echoing from behind me. Some sounded like Jack. Others were those horrible Wendigo shrieks. I had everything needed for the ritual. Jack's blood in the bottle, the tribal elder's necklace, and I reached into my pocket Timothy's old dog tags I'd found at his campsite. The last piece of who he used to be. The tunnel started sloping upward. My legs were burning, but I couldn't stop. According to Jack's journal pages, the sacred site was in a clearing where the first Wendigo was created hundreds of years ago. The ritual had to be done exactly at midnight, under the blood moon. Finally, I saw moonlight ahead. The tunnel opened into a circular clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the center stood 7 stone pillars, each carved with the same symbols I'd seen in the bunker. The blood moon hung directly overhead, turning everything a dark red. But I wasn't alone. "I knew you'd come here, brother." The voice was Timothy's, but wrong, like someone was scraping ice against glass. He stepped out from behind one of the pillars, but he wasn't my brother anymore. He was one of them now, impossibly tall and thin, his skin almost transparent, those horrible white eyes glowing. More Wendigos emerged from the trees. Among them was one that moved strangely, jerking and twitching. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I recognized Jack's jacket on its twisted form. "Jack," I whispered. "I was too late to save him." "He's with us now," Timothy's Wendigo said, smiling with too many sharp teeth. "Just like you'll be. The hunger, Rich. It makes everything so clear. No more pain, no more fear. Just the endless hunt." I had to keep him talking. The journal said midnight was the exact moment for the ritual, and I could see the moon wasn't quite in position yet. "What happened to you, Tim?" I asked, slowly moving toward the center of the pillars. "Why did you stay here when you knew something was wrong?" "I found the truth," he said, his long fingers scraping against the stone pillar. "These forests hold such old power. The hunger sets you free. You'll understand soon." The other Wendigos were closing in, moving in that horrible smooth way, like shadows flowing over the ground. Jack's Wendigo was getting closer too, but something was different about him. He was fighting it. I could see him twitching, trying to hold back. The moon reached its peak. It was time. I broke open the bottle of Jack's blood, splashed it on Timothy's dog tags, and held up the tribal necklace. The Wendigos screamed and rushed forward, but before they could reach me, I started speaking the words from the journal. What happened next would change everything, if I survived to finish the ritual. The ancient words felt strange in my mouth, but each one I spoke made the blood moon glow brighter. The Wendigos shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring, but they couldn't cross the circle of pillars. An invisible barrier held them back. Timothy's Wendigo form slammed against the barrier, his white eyes blazing. "Stop!" he screamed, but I kept reading. The dog tags in my hand began to glow red, dripping with Jack's blood. Then something incredible happened. The ground around the pillars cracked open and bright blue light poured out. The Wendigos backed away, hissing like angry cats. All except Jack's Wendigo. He was fighting to move forward, his body shaking as if two forces were fighting inside him. "Keep going." Jack's voice came out broken, fighting through the Wendigo's screech. "Finish it." I spoke the final words, holding up the glowing necklace. The blue light shot up into the blood moon, and suddenly everything went silent. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. Then Timothy's Wendigo form started to change. His long limbs began shrinking, the pale skin darkening. He fell to his knees, screaming, but it was Timothy's real voice now. The other Wendigos tried to run, but the blue light caught them, forcing them to change too. But something was wrong. The journal hadn't mentioned the pain in my chest, like my heart was freezing, or the hunger that suddenly hit me like a truck. I looked at my hands. Frost was spreading across them. The ritual. Jack's Wendigo form spoke, fighting for each word. "Takes a sacrifice. Someone must take their place." I understood then. To save them, someone had to become the new Wendigo. The hunger had to go somewhere. Timothy was almost human again, lying on the ground, breathing hard. The other Wendigos were changing back into people too, lost hikers and campers who had disappeared over the years. The frost was spreading up my arms now. The hunger was getting worse, but seeing Timothy's human face again, it was worth it. "Rich?" Timothy looked up at me, his eyes normal again. "What's to you?" "It's okay," I said, even as I felt my bones starting to stretch. "This is what big brothers do. We protect our family." Jack's Wendigo form stumbled forward. "Not alone," he growled. "Won't let you face this alone." He grabbed my freezing hand. The blue light swirled around us both. "Two guardians," he said, "stronger together. We protect the forest, keep others away, keep the hunger contained." The transformation was happening faster now. But Jack was right. Sharing it made it easier to hold on to our human minds. We weren't becoming monsters. We were becoming guardians. The last thing I saw as a human was Timothy running toward me, tears in his eyes. Then the cold took over completely, and I changed. But I didn't lose myself. Jack and I became something new, neither human nor Wendigo, but protectors of the forest. We would keep its dark secrets and make sure no one else ever had to face the hunger. Timothy and the others made it out. They told the police they'd been lost in the woods, nothing more. But sometimes, on cold nights, when the moon is full, I watch from the trees as Timothy visits the forest's edge. He leaves food and notes, telling me about his life. He knows I'm still here, still watching over him. Different, but still his brother. And on quiet nights when the hunger grows strong, Jack and I run through our forest. Not hunting, but protecting. Keeping the ancient darkness at bay. This is our purpose now. This is our home. And if you're reading this, remember, some forests are better left unexplored. Some hunger is better left unfed. But know that we're here, watching, protecting. The Wendigo Guardians of Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest. My name is Bill Harrison, and I never thought I'd return to these woods. Yet here I am, steering our old 1969 Winnebago Brave through the winding roads of northern Maine, my 17-year-old son Kevin slumped in the passenger seat beside me. He hasn't spoken a word since we left Portland 3 hours ago, but I can see his hands shaking when he thinks I'm not looking. The trees seem taller than I remember them, their shadows longer, darker somehow. Maybe it's just my guilt playing tricks on me. 20 years ago, I was part of the logging crew that tore through these forests like a plague of locusts. Now I'm back, hoping to make things right, though I'm not sure how. "Dad, this is stupid," Kevin mumbles, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. "Why couldn't I just stay home with Mom?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Because, son, we both need this. You need to get clean, and I need to face some things." The Winnebago's headlights catch a wooden sign. "Welcome to Baxter State Park." As we pass it, I swear I hear something crack in the woods, like a tree falling, but not quite right. Kevin hears it too. I see him sit up straighter. That's when we spot her. An old woman standing at the side of the road, her silver hair glowing in our headlights. She's holding up her hand, and something tells me we need to stop. Who stops for strangers in the middle of nowhere? Kevin protests as I pull over. The woman, she must be in her late 70s, walks to my window with surprising speed. Her eyes are sharp, alert, and somehow ancient. "You're the Harrison boy," she says to me. Not a question. "I knew your father when he logged these woods. I'm Martha Winters." A chill runs down my spine. My father disappeared in these woods 30 years ago. They never found his body. "You shouldn't have come back." Martha continues, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But since you're here, you need to know about those who walk between trees. They've been waiting for you, both of you." Kevin lets out a harsh laugh, but I can hear the fear behind it. And as Martha speaks, I notice something strange. The trees behind her seem to be leaning closer, as if they're listening too. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of our nightmare in Baxter State Park. Martha insisted we follow her to her cabin, just off the main park road. I probably should have said no, but something in her eyes told me we needed to hear what she had to say. Kevin dragged his feet behind us, muttering under his breath about crazy old ladies. Her cabin was small but neat, filled with strange things I couldn't explain. On one wall hung dozens of plaster casts of footprints, huge ones, way bigger than any human foot. Photos covered another wall, most of them blurry, showing dark shapes between trees. But what really caught my eye was a piece of wood on her table, split open to show what looked like dried blood inside. "That's from last month," Martha said, catching me staring. "The trees bleed when they're trying to warn us, just like they did before your father vanished." Kevin slumped into a chair, sweating despite the cool evening air. I knew the signs. Withdrawal was hitting him hard. But Martha's next words made me forget about that for a moment. "The loggers awakened something old in these woods," she said, pouring us tea that smelled like pine needles. something that was sleeping. Your father knew it. That's why he tried to stop the cutting. But by then, it was too late. I remembered that last week before Dad disappeared. He'd been acting strange, talking about voices in the forest, about tracks that appeared and disappeared. Everyone thought he was losing his mind. The forest walkers, Martha continued, pointing to the biggest footprint cast. They're not what you should fear. They protect the woods. It's the other things, the ones that can slip inside your mind, that you need to watch for. A loud crack from outside made us all jump. Through the window, I saw our Winnebago, and could have sworn it had sunk an inch or two into the ground. They know you're here now, Martha whispered. Both of you. The forest remembers the Harrison blood, and it has plans for you. She looked straight at Kevin. Especially you, young man. Your weakness. It calls to them. Kevin stood up so fast his chair fell over. This is crazy. Dad, we need to leave now. But as we stepped outside, the forest had changed. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching toward us like fingers. The air felt thick, heavy with something more than just moisture. And somewhere in the darkness, something was moving between the pines. Martha grabbed my arm. Listen carefully. You'll need these. She pressed a cloth bag into my hands. It was filled with small wooden carvings and what looked like dried mushrooms. When the whispers start, burn these. And whatever you do, don't let Kevin wander off alone after dark. As we walked back to our RV, I heard it. A sound like footsteps, but too heavy, too slow to be human. Kevin heard it too. I could tell by the way he froze mid-step. Dad? His voice shook. What was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because at that moment, every tree around us started oozing amber-colored sap that glowed in the moonlight. Our first night in Baxter State Park was just beginning, and already I knew we'd made a terrible mistake coming here. That first night in the RV was the longest of my life. The wind howled outside, but it didn't sound natural, more like whispers trying to form words. Kevin tossed and turned in his bunk, fighting his demons, while I sat at the small table, staring out the window. Around midnight, something changed. The ground under the RV started to pulse, like a giant heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I pressed my hand against the floor and felt it vibrate. Dad? Kevin's voice was small, scared. The trees are moving. I looked out and saw he was right. The pines were swaying, but there was no wind. Worse, they seemed closer than before. I could have sworn we'd parked at least 30 feet from the nearest tree, but now branches were almost touching our windows. That's when we saw the tracks. In the moonlight, they looked fresh. Huge footprints pressed deep into the soil, each one bigger than a dinner plate. They formed a perfect circle around our RV. We need to check the ground, I said, grabbing a flashlight. The RV feels like it's sinking. Kevin followed me outside, sticking close. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like breathing soup. When I shined the light under the RV, my heart nearly stopped. The wheels had sunk 6 inches into the ground, but the soil around them wasn't disturbed. It was like the earth had turned to quicksand, just under our vehicle. A crack echoed through the trees, followed by a thud that shook the ground. Something was walking in the forest, something big. Inside, I whispered. Now. We barely made it back in when we saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. Not just tall, but massive, 10 feet at least. It walked on 2 legs, but the way it moved, no human moves like that. Kevin grabbed my arm. Dad, look at the windows. Frost was spreading across the glass, but it wasn't normal frost. It was forming patterns, shapes that looked like faces, screaming faces. Then we heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that shook our bones. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, but something in between. The trees responded, their branches scratching against our roof like fingernails. The bag, Kevin whispered. The one Martha gave you. She said to burn something when the whispers start. My hands shook as I opened the cloth bag. The dried mushrooms inside smelled like earth and decay. I found matches in the kitchen and burned one in our sink. The effect was instant. The scratching stopped. The frost melted. The heavy footsteps moved away. But as the mushroom burned, we saw something that made my blood run cold. In the smoke, shapes formed, like memories made of mist. I saw my father's face, younger than I remembered, his eyes wide with fear. Then the smoke showed trees, hundreds of them, falling as men with chainsaws laughed. Kevin saw something in the smoke, too. Whatever it was made him curl up in his bunk, shaking. "What's happening to us?" he whispered. I wished I had an answer, but looking out at the dark forest, watching the trees slowly close in around us, I knew we were trapped. The forest had us now, and it wasn't going to let us go easily. That night, neither of us slept. We just listened to the whispers, watched the shadows move, and waited for dawn. But somehow I knew, when the sun came up, things would only get worse. Morning came, but the sun barely reached us through the thick canopy. The RV had sunk another few inches overnight, and Kevin was in bad shape. His withdrawal symptoms were getting worse, but there was something else too, something the forest was doing to him. "They keep calling me," he said, his face pale and sweaty. "The voices, they're getting clearer. They want me to go deeper into the woods." I made us both coffee, trying to act normal even though nothing was normal anymore. That's when we found the first totem. It was just sitting on our doorstep, though neither of us had heard anyone approach during the night. It was a crude figure carved from dark wood, twisted into an impossible shape. "We need to talk to Martha again," I said, but when we tried to start the RV, the engine just clicked. Dead. We were stuck. With no choice, we decided to walk back to Martha's cabin. The forest felt different in daylight, not safer, just better at hiding things. The trees had made a path for us, their branches bending to form a tunnel. It wasn't the way we'd come yesterday, but it seemed to be the only way we could go. "Dad," Kevin stopped suddenly. "Look at this." He was pointing at an old loggers' camp I knew hadn't been there before. The buildings were rotting, covered in moss, but they looked decades old. Impossible. I knew every logging camp in these woods, and this wasn't one of them. Inside the main cabin, we found more totems, hundreds of them hanging from the ceiling. Each one showed a different face, frozen in fear. In the corner, there was a map of the forest pinned to the wall. It was my old logging map, the one I'd used 20 years ago, but the landmarks were all wrong. The forest had changed, grown, shifted somehow. A deep boom echoed through the woods like a giant drum. "They're coming," Kevin whispered. His eyes had changed. They looked greener than before, like pine needles. Through the cabin's dirty window, we saw them. 3 massive figures moving through the trees. The smallest was about 8 feet tall, the largest closer to 15. They walked on 2 legs, but moved like shadows, their bodies seeming to melt into the trees and reappear elsewhere. "Forest walkers," I breathed, remembering Martha's words. The largest one turned its head toward our cabin, its face. I'll never forget that face. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was like the forest itself had grown a face, all bark and moss and ancient wisdom. Kevin started walking toward the door like he was in a trance. "They're saying I belong with them, Dad. They can make the pain stop." I grabbed his arm, but his skin was cold as ice and rough like tree bark. The change was happening faster than I'd thought. The ground started pulsing again, and roots burst through the cabin floor, wrapping around our feet. The forest walkers were getting closer, and the trees were closing in around the cabin. That's when we heard Martha's voice, calling from somewhere outside. "Run, they're not ready for you yet." I pulled Kevin hard, breaking him out of his trance, and we ran. Behind us, the cabin groaned and cracked as the forest consumed it. The forest walkers didn't chase us. They didn't need to. They knew we couldn't escape. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, only to realize we had no idea where we were. The forest had changed again. Every direction looked the same, and somewhere in the distance, those giant drums kept beating. Kevin collapsed against a tree, gasping. Where his hand touched the bark, Green veins spread like lightning. He looked at me with those pine needle eyes and said something that chilled me to my bones. Dad, I can hear them clearly now. They're saying this is just the beginning. The forest isn't trying to kill us. It's trying to change us. The drums got louder, and the transformation of my son continued, while somewhere in these cursed woods, the forest walkers waited patiently for what was to come. We found Martha waiting for us in a small clearing, though I could have sworn we'd been running in the opposite direction from her cabin. She looked different now, older and younger at the same time, if that makes any sense. Her silver hair moved like it was underwater, even though there was no wind. The forest is claiming him faster than I thought, she said, looking at Kevin. The green veins had spread up his arms now, and tiny leaves were sprouting from his fingertips. He didn't even seem scared anymore, just tired and confused. Tell me how to stop this, I begged Martha. There has to be a way. She shook her head slowly. You can't stop it, Bill. The forest chose Kevin the moment you entered these woods, his addiction. It made him perfect. Empty spaces want to be filled, and the forest knows how to fill them. A deep moan echoed through the trees, the sound of wood bending and stretching. The forest walkers were getting closer again. But why? Kevin's voice cracked. Why us? Why our family? Martha's eyes turned dark like old bark. Because of what your grandfather did. He didn't just cut down trees. He cut down the ancient one, the first tree, the one that held all the forest's memories. Your father found out and tried to make it right, but the forest demanded payment. Now it wants the last of the Harrison blood. The ground started shaking. Around us, mushrooms burst from the soil, forming a perfect circle. They glowed with a pale blue light, and I could hear whispers coming from them, voices speaking in a language I almost understood. The fungal network, Martha explained. It's how the forest thinks, how it talks. And right now, it's talking about you, Kevin. Kevin stepped into the mushroom circle before I could stop him. The moment he did, his eyes rolled back, showing only white. He spoke, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was deeper, older, like the voice of the earth itself. I see them all, he said. Everyone the forest took. Dad, I see Grandpa. He's part of it now. He's in the trees, in the roots. He's everywhere. That's when the forest walkers appeared. They stepped out of the trees like they were made of shadows, their huge forms blocking out what little sunlight filtered through the canopy. The largest one, the ancient one, reached out toward Kevin with a hand made of twisted branches and moss. I tried to run to my son, but roots burst from the ground holding me in place. Martha put a hand on my shoulder. Watch, she whispered. This is what needs to happen. The ancient one touched Kevin's forehead, and my son gasped. Green light poured from his eyes and mouth. His skin turned to bark before my eyes, his hair to leaves. He was becoming part of the forest. Dad, he said, his voice now a whisper like wind through leaves. I don't hurt anymore. The forest, it's healing me. Tears ran down my face as I watched my son transform. But they weren't just tears of sadness. There was something else in them, something that burned and tingled. Looking at my reflection in a puddle, I saw that my own eyes had started to turn green too. Martha nodded slowly. The Harrison blood was cursed, but curses can become blessings. The forest isn't punishing you anymore. It's welcoming you home. The drums started again, louder than ever, and the transformation continued. As the forest claimed us both, I finally understood what my father had tried to tell me all those years ago. Sometimes, the only way to fix what you've broken is to become part of it. And somewhere deep in Baxter State Park, the trees shifted to make room for their newest guardians. The transformation wasn't quick or painless. I watched as Kevin's body stretched and grew, reaching up toward the canopy. His fingers lengthened into branches, his skin hardening into rough bark. But his eyes, they stayed the same green, watching me with a strange peace I hadn't seen in him since before the drugs. It doesn't hurt anymore, Dad, he kept saying, his voice now sounding like rustling leaves. I can feel everything. The whole forest. It's alive. The Ancient One placed its massive hand on my shoulder, and suddenly I could see what Kevin meant. Images flooded my mind, memories stored in the trees. I saw my father's last day, not as a tragedy, but as a homecoming. He hadn't disappeared. He'd become part of something bigger. That's when the ground began to shake violently. Our old Winnebago, still parked where we'd left it, started sinking faster into the earth. But it wasn't being swallowed, it was changing. Metal turned to wood, windows to hollow knots, wheels to thick roots. The RV was becoming a shrine, a new anchor point for the forest's power. Martha stepped into the center of the mushroom circle, and her human form melted away. She was ancient, older than the oldest trees, her true form made of twisted roots and glowing moss. "The curse must end tonight," she said, her voice echoing from every tree around us. "The forest needs guardians who understand both worlds. That's why it chose you both, logger and son, destroyer and healer." The forest walkers began a slow, rhythmic movement, their huge forms swaying like trees in a storm. The drum-like sounds came from their feet hitting the ground, sending vibrations through the entire forest. "Dad," Kevin called out, now nearly 15 feet tall, his body a mixture of human and tree. "Someone's coming. Someone who wants to hurt the forest." I could feel it too, the rumble of machinery in the distance. A new logging company, coming to cut down more trees. The forest showed me visions of what would happen if they succeeded. Death, emptiness, the ancient powers broken forever. My transformation sped up then. The green veins spread across my chest, and I felt my feet root themselves into the soil. But unlike Kevin, I wasn't becoming just a tree. The forest was turning me into something else, a walker, a guardian. "The Harrison blood carries both the wound and the healing," Martha explained. "Kevin will be the heart, rooted and strong. You, Bill, will be the defender, the one who walks between worlds." The Ancient One raised its arms, and the entire forest seemed to breathe with one mind. Kevin's transformation completed first, he became a magnificent pine, taller and stronger than any natural tree. His consciousness spread through the fungal network beneath our feet. As for me, my body grew and changed, until I stood as tall as the forest walkers. My skin became like living wood, able to shift and move, to melt into the trees and emerge elsewhere. I could feel the forest's power flowing through me, and with it came understanding. This was our redemption. This was how we would protect what my grandfather had tried to destroy. The curse hadn't been a punishment, it had been preparing our family for this moment, this transformation. Martha smiled, her form shimmering like moonlight on water. "The circle is complete. The forest has its new guardians." In the distance, we could hear the logging trucks getting closer. But we were ready now. The forest had changed us, saved us, made us whole. And we would protect it, not just with our new powers, but with the understanding that came from having once been its enemies. Kevin's consciousness touched mine through the fungal network, and I felt his happiness, his freedom from addiction, his love for his new purpose. Together, we would guard these woods, father and son, walker and heart, for as long as the forest needed us. The drums reached a crescendo, and the night came alive with ancient power. The loggers would arrive to find a very different forest than the one they planned to destroy. And somewhere in the depths of Baxter State Park, two new legends were born, the tree that heals and the walker who guards. Our story was just beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the forest became our new home. I learned to move like the other walkers, stepping between trees as easily as walking through doorways. Kevin's tree form stood tall and proud in the heart of the park, his branches offering shelter to animals and his roots spreading wisdom through the fungal network. The logging company didn't stand a chance. When their trucks arrived, they found paths that led nowhere, equipment that wouldn't start, and trees that seemed to move when no one was looking. Some workers reported seeing giant shadows walking between the pines, while others heard whispers that made them drop their chainsaws and run. But we weren't just guardians, we were healers too. Through Kevin's roots, we could feel people entering the forest who were like he used to be, lost, addicted, hurting. The forest called to them differently now. One night, a teenage girl stumbled into the clearing where Kevin's tree stood. She was shaking, running from her own demons, just like my son once did. I watched from the shadows as Kevin's branches swayed, even without wind, creating patterns of moonlight that danced around her. "You're safe here," I said, keeping my walker form hidden in the darkness. "The forest knows your pain." She didn't run. Something in my voice, something human still there, made her trust me. Over the next few hours, the forest worked its magic. Not turning her into one of us, but healing her in its own way. When she left the next morning, she was stronger. Word spread, and more people came seeking help. Martha, in her true ancient form, taught us more each day. We learned how to read the weather in the way moss grows, how to speak with the wind, how to guide lost hikers home. The curse that had haunted the Harrison family for generations had become a gift. But the forest held one last surprise. One misty morning, I felt a familiar presence moving through the trees. Using my walker abilities, I shifted through shadow and bark until I found its source. There, in a grove of ancient pines, stood my father. He wasn't quite human anymore. Decades of being part of the forest had changed him. His form shifted between man and tree, but his eyes were the same ones I remembered from childhood. "I knew you'd find your way here eventually, son," he said, his voice like autumn leaves crackling underfoot. "Your boy, too. The forest has always known what our family needed. Together, 3 generations of Harrisons now guard these woods. Kevin's tree stands tallest among the pines, a beacon of healing. I walk the shadows as a forest walker, protecting our borders. And my father drifts between forms, a living link between past and present. The curse is broken, but the magic remains. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full, you can hear drums beating deep in Baxter State Park. If you're lost or hurting, follow that sound. Look for the tallest pine tree with green eyes in its bark, or watch for the shadow that walks like a man but stands as tall as ancient things. We're still here, my son and I, protecting these woods. Not because we have to anymore, but because we finally found where we belong. The forest that once haunted our family now is our family. And if you ever find yourself in these woods, remember, not all monsters are here to harm. Sometimes, the things we fear most are trying to help us find our way home. That's our story. The story of how a curse became a blessing, how addiction became healing, and how the Harrison family finally found peace among the eternal pines of Baxter State Park. Just listen for the drums. They're calling you home too.